All right, welcome everyone. Welcome back to our third session of the day. Good afternoon and welcome to our annual user symposium. So my name is Brittany Wood and I'm a customer success manager at Web Checkout, and I'll be leading our third session of the day where we'll be discussing managing circulating rooms. So we'll get started by reviewing our agenda today, or here's our agenda. Now, our key objective today will really focus on reframing existing features you may already be familiar with when you're managing equipment, and we'll be learning how to apply those to locations. So first, we'll introduce you to room circulation by demonstrating how to really circulate and reserve rooms in Web Checkout. Then we'll review adding and editing locations in Web Checkout. And finally, we'll take a brief look at a few settings and policies to use when actually circulating locations. Then finally, we'll take a look at a few special considerations and key takeaways to keep in mind when managing locations. And finally, we'll end our session today by answering some questions. So please, if you haven't yet, locate that Zoom chat and ask those questions. All right, so let's start by answering a very simple question. Why should we manage locations in Web Checkout? So some of the top reasons to add locations into Web Checkout is to manage their schedules or circulate locations using the same application you already use for equipment. Adding locations in Web Checkout will allow students and staff to independently reserve spaces as needed, such as workspaces, labs, studios, and meeting spaces. You can manage schedules for limited classrooms or event spaces. Adding locations will create a history of who actually used the room. And managing locations in Web Checkout will allow you to use features that you already rely on, such as emails, patron portal, customer reports, and RRT. And additionally, you can assign equipment inventory to locations to track the location of your equipment. Now, due to popular demand, today we are really going to be focused specifically on circulating locations, so those room reservations in Web Checkout. However, I do want to note that locations can also be used to perform location-based inventories. You can use locations to create delivery locations and also for facility or key management. All right, so now that we understand why you should be managing locations in Web Checkout, let's actually demonstrate how to circulate these locations in Web Checkout. All right. So you should see me navigating out of our slides and back into Web Checkout. All right, now you may be surprised to hear that managing locations in Web Checkout is quite similar to managing your equipment. Locations, once added into Web Checkout, are still found using the same screens you use to locate your equipment. So we'll still be using find screens in order to locate our rooms. So let's take a look. So within the resources menu, we can use find resources or the more specific find locations option. Now on a find screen, you can search for all of the locations that you've added into Web Checkout using these search terms on the left-hand panel of the screen. And these search terms act to filter your results, so you can search for locations and build reports. Now, when I'm working with locations, some of my favorite search terms to use includes resource type or resource type ancestor, so that I can search for a type of location or a category of location. I also really like to use home location or ancestor or home location ancestor to help me search for locations nested within other locations, such as searching for all rooms in a building or all buildings within a campus. And I also like to use room minimum and maximum. So that's two search terms you can include on a find screen. And these help you to search for locations that will accommodate groups of a specific size, such as for an event. Now today on my find screen, I want to view all locations found in the production center basement. So I'm going to use this home location ancestor search term and include production center basement. And now when I select find, by performing this search, I can see that there are 10 locations or 10 rooms found in the production center basement. So now that we've demonstrated how to search for locations in web checkout or to search for rooms in web checkout, let's review some of the details that can be added or edited within these rooms. And we'll take a look at this Adobe Edit Bay number 3. All right, now every location in web checkout still has its own resource detail screen where you can manage specifics. Detail screens are where you can add and edit location information. Now, this information can also be updated in mass using the resource import file. So that same file you use to edit equipment or to add equipment. But you will notice some key differences in the resource detail screen for a location. So if we look at the specifications tab, you will notice that there are fewer fields. So you're only going to see fields that are relevant to locations. And additionally, you are going to notice this resources tab, which again is available on a detail screen for a location. And this resource tab is going to show you all of the resources housed in that location. Looking at this edit bay, you can see that there is a MacBook Pro, reference monitors, reference speakers, and even headphones housed within this specific location. All right, so now that we've completed a quick review of how to search for your locations and view location information, let's take a look at how circulating locations may work at your checkout center. Now, before we review this process, it's important to understand that each checkout center may be set up just a bit differently. So we do encourage you to work with a customer success manager to ensure that your center is configured properly for your center's unique needs. So let's get started by reserving a room within the patron portal. So for those of you unfamiliar with Patron Portal, this is a simplified interface where students and staff can log in, browse through the equipment or locations they're authorized to use, and independently create reservations. And we're going to start by creating a reservation. So I'll select Reserve and choose my circulating location center. And we'll start our reservation by browsing through the catalog and adding a room to our reservation. So I'm going to select this catalog icon. And as you browse through the catalog, you'll notice that I organize my locations based on their. So my locations are classified into classrooms, edit bays, meeting spaces, studios, etc. Now, in order to reserve, I'll need to navigate through the different nested resource types until I see a reservation option. So I'll be able to reserve a location by selecting this green plus icon. Now in my checkout center, I only allow patrons to reserve a location by type using RRT. So that's reservation by resource type. And patrons must select this green icon to reserve a room by type. They are not allowed at my center to choose a specific room. Instead, when users reserve through the patron portal, web checkout is set up to assign them a specific room of that type. So now that I see that I've added one into my cart, let's exit out of the catalog. And now if we take a look at the reservation, you'll notice that even though I reserved by type, reviewing my contents tab, you can see that web checkout or the patron portal has actually already specified the exact room that I should basically go to at my designated start time. Now I'll show you how to configure this behavior when we review settings and policies a bit later. Now, we could also reserve locations using the traditional methods, reserving by an individual room or ID, or we could also reserve a room using RRT. For now, let's add a start and end time, as well as our additional information. So at my checkout center, I require patrons to be out of the location by the end of the current business day. To help with this, I've added policies to help control allocations and ensure that they end by the end of the business day. Now, I've also included circulation windows, which display available pickup and return times based upon my center's hours of operation that day. So let's include a pickup time. So we'll pick up today at 3:00 p.m. and I must return before the end of the day. So we'll say 7:00 p.m. All right, now let's review our other requirements. At my checkout center, patrons are required to agree to my equipment use policy, and they can select this eye icon right here to view some additional information. Now, patrons must select this checkbox to agree to our policy and save in order to continue with their reservation. All right, so now that we've provided all of the required information, we can save this reservation by selecting this save icon right here. And now that we've saved, we can view this upcoming reservation within the patron portal. And in my checkout center, folks can edit their upcoming reservation. And I also allow for renewals once the start time has begun. All right. Now, so now that we've submitted this reservation, patrons also will now receive a reservation created email. All right. And up on the screen, you should now see that email. Now, I've customized the reservation created email with actual check-in instructions and details more specific to circulating locations. So you'll notice that I've included both reservation information, so the start time, end time, and that reserved location, as well as the actual check-in process they should follow for location specifically. So now let's navigate into web checkout and take a look at that upcoming reservation. All right, and here's that reservation that I just created. Now, reservations or allocations at my checkout center auto-circulate. So this means that operators are not required to actually pick up these reservations at the designated start time or return these incoming checkouts at the scheduled end time. So there is actually really no pickup or return process to demonstrate. Rather, that typically occurs automatically. So web checkout will automatically pick up these outgoing reservations at the scheduled start time and return these checkouts by the scheduled end time. And throughout our session today, you should notice these allocations update. You'll see this reservation move over to incoming, and you will see this checkout for Saul be returned as we're presenting here today. So if you notice these panels change, that's because these are auto-circulating. All right. So now that we've reviewed the reservation, we discussed what auto-circulate is and how that helps me to manage locations. How did I actually set up this checkout center? Now, you may find that you are already familiar with the process that I use to set up and create this checkout center. To successfully implement circulating locations in web checkout, you must have a good understanding of adding resources and types and fine-tuning settings and policies. So first we'll review the building blocks of any checkout center, adding resources and types to create your inventory. If circulating locations have restrictions, you will also need to add group authorizations and resource type certifications. To configure your checkout center, you will also need to add organization, checkout center. You'll need to add organization, checkout center, and potentially resource type settings and policies. And then finally, to manage circulating locations effectively, you will want to test all of these circulating processes to ensure success. So let's get started with step number 1, reviewing how to actually add locations into web checkout. All right, and you should see me navigating into web checkout right now. And we'll start by creating a reservation just to demonstrate what resources and types are in web checkout. Now, both resources and resource types are required to create circulating rooms or circulating locations in web checkout. So let's go ahead and define those terms. Now, resource types help to organize and categorize your location resources. They also provide a really user-friendly way to ensure you are reserving the correct category of a room for your allocation. So again, you'll notice that I organize my locations based upon the purpose that they serve. So here we could reserve a classroom or one of my 2 types of editing bays, or I could reserve a meeting space in web checkout. Now, the resources in web checkout are the actual locations that you would circulate or manage. So these are the actual classrooms, meeting spaces, etc. And looking at the Adobe Edit Bay, again, Adobe Edit Bay is the resource type or category, whereas Adobe Edit Bay 1 through 5, these are the actual resources. So resources are the actual locations. Resource types are your categories of locations. Now on the screen, again, you'll see that I have 5 Adobe Edit Bays, whereas I only have 1 category for Adobe Edit Bays. Now you can import locations using the resource and resource type import file, or you can create these resources and types manually. For our session today, we'll review how to add locations manually. So first, we have to start by adding our resource types. So we can create types manually several ways. Under this resources menu, we could select new resource type, or we can use actions, which are found in the resource type detail screen. So in a resource type detail screen, under the admin tab, you'll see an action to duplicate this type and create a new subtype. So we'll start by creating a resource type for reservable daily use office spaces. So I'm going to select resources, new resource type, and now we can add a few details to this resource type. So we'll first update the name to daily use office spaces, and we'll also need to include a resource type ID. So the resource type ID is the unique identifier, and the unique identifier must be unique, meaning there are no duplicates with any other types in web checkout. Even with location resource types, we do recommend following that same consistent and unique naming convention that you've previously used when creating resource types for equipment. Now I'll also add a few other details to this type, and I'm going to include a description for patron portal. So this description that I'm adding in the type will be visible in the patron portal. And you saw this earlier when I was reserving in the patron portal. Just to point this out to you really quick. Oh, let me cancel this. Sorry, folks. All right, this description that I'm adding in the patron portal will be visible right here. All right, so now that I've added my description, we can submit this resource type, and this will load the resource type detail screen for our reservable daily use office spaces, and we can continue to add details. And I'm actually going to add an image to this resource type. So adding an image into web checkout requires 2 steps. We do recommend uploading your image as an attachment. So we recommend uploading that image as a public URL and then copying that image URL into this image URL field right now. So let's add an image for our office spaces by selecting this Attachments tab. And then we'll choose our image by selecting Add Attachment. And next we'll choose our file. So I'll choose my JPEG image. And now I can include a description just to provide a bit more context. And then most importantly, I'm going to update the visibility. Now, in order to use this image or this attachment as the image URL, we must update the visibility to public. We must use a public attachment to create that image URL. Now, public attachments, I do recommend being mindful of because public attachments will be visible in both Patron Portal, web checkout, and create a publicly accessible URL. All right, now when I select Submit, this will create that attachment, and now I have to copy this public URL. And I'll simply copy and paste into this image URL field right here. All right, so now that we've included an image for the resource type, we can actually preview this image on this left-hand panel right here. And this will create that thumbnail image, which you saw earlier while we were browsing our different location resource types within the Patron Portal. All right. So now that we've added a resource type and we've included a few key details, let's actually add our location resources. So again, these are the actual locations or rooms that you will manage. So we'll need to add in the actual office spaces that folks can reserve. Now again, resources can be imported in mass using the resource import file, or we can add these resource types manually. So to add manually, under the resources menu, we could use the new location option, or we could use, again, these action shortcuts found in the resource and resource type detail screen. So I like a shortcut, so I'm going to use this action and select make a resource of this type. Here, a modal will appear and we can begin to include our details for our resources. So first, we must include our resource ID. So I'm going to include office space 1001. Next, we'll want to review the resource class. And this is a really important step because resource class is going to determine if this is a piece of equipment, a location, media, or key, and resource class cannot be edited. So if you are adding locations, please be sure to double check and ensure that your resource class is correct prior to creating. Next, we'll want to review the circulating option. So if your locations will be available for checkout and reservation, you will want to select circulating. Now, finally, let's add a few other details. So I'm going to update my room capacity to 2. I'm going to update the room number to 1001. And then finally, let's add a home location so that we can tell web checkout which building these office spaces live in. So I'm going to say this office space lives in or can be found in Mills Hall. All right. So now that we've added our details, I'm going to select Submit, and this will create our very first location resource. Now, before moving further, I do always recommend just to double check your information. So make sure that the resource ID is correct, the resource type, resource class, etc. is correct. And you can double check your work on this left-hand panel, as well as throughout the resource detail screen. All right, now because I like a shortcut, we're going to create 2 more office spaces, but I'm going to do that by using the duplicate this resource shortcut. So by selecting this option, all I need to do is create a new unique resource ID, select continue, and now that location has been duplicated, and I can simply review my details and make changes where needed. All right, and we'll add 1 more, again by duplicating our work. All right, and we just added 3 location resources to the daily use office space resource type. All right, so now that we've added our resources, let's review how we can include items within each of these locations. Now, I already took the time to import some keyboards, monitors, and printers, so we won't be doing that today. In order to add resources into each of these locations, it's important to understand that you must import those locations first, or import those resources first, or add those equipment manually into web checkout. Now, in order to move those items into these home locations, we can either update the home location field. We will update the home location field for each of those items. So to do that, I'm going to search for my first keyboard. And we can update home location either within this inventory tab by updating this home location field. We could also, in the admin tab, use this, move this resource option. All right, so we're going to add keyboard 1 to office space 1. We'll also add a printer. And we'll add a monitor. All right, now because we did add several items quite quickly to office space 1001, let's check our work. And I'm going to do that by searching for office space 1001. And now we can review the resources that are assigned to that home location within this resources tab. So now we can see that we've successfully included a monitor, keyboard, and printer, all to my office space number 1. All right, so now we've added resource types, or we've added a resource type, we've added resources to that type, and furthermore, we've included equipment resources within our locations. So I know that was a really brief review on how to add location, resources, and types. The key thing to understand is you will use those same methods that you use to add equipment resources, also to add locations. So now that we've added our locations, let's discuss some settings and policies you may want to use to better manage these locations. While we won't have enough time today to cover the entire setup of all settings and policies, we'll discuss just a few key settings which make my checkout center a bit unique. So let's start by looking at our calendar. And to do that, we'll navigate to Admin, Checkout Center, and over here to the Calendar tab. All right, now the Checkout Center calendar is definitely not unique, but it is required to circulate resources, and that includes your locations without an override, and also to use the patron portal. The calendar defines when the start and end times for reservations or for checkouts may be scheduled, and it is typically defined by your checkout center's hours of operation. Now for room reservations, we'll want to consider when our locations or our rooms are actually available for use. Are your locations available 24/7? Are locations only available when your building is open? Or are locations only available when your checkout center is open and staffed? This checkout center calendar should reflect the hours that the rooms are actually available for use and when they'll be accessible to your patrons. Now, as a quick note, if you manage both locations and equipment at a single checkout center, it's important to understand that all resources, both your equipment and your locations, will be available for pickup and return when the checkout center is open according to this calendar right here. And if your equipment and locations circulate on different schedules, we do often recommend 2 separate checkout centers to better manage this. Now, in my checkout center, my locations are typically available during the week from 7 a.m. to 10 o'clock p.m. with slightly shorter hours on the weekends. And no pickups or returns may occur beyond these hours, and all patrons must leave their reserved location by closing time. So now let's take a look at a few policies that help to enforce these rules. Now, remember, these are the policies that I've adjusted for the unique scenario described at my center, and each center is a bit unique, so please keep that in mind. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with policies, policies typically define usage rules for your center. And many policies may be set at your organization, checkout center, or even for specific resource types. And your policies may also vary depending on the patron class or the policy class. Now, within your checkout center or organization detail screens, you will see many different policies across the allocations, resource type, patron portal, and billing tab. So they're kind of sprinkled across the application. Now we'll start first by reviewing a few policies found here on the allocation tab. And the first 2 policies we're going to discuss are the minimum and maximum checkout reserve policy. Now, for most of my clients, I typically almost always recommend setting these 2 policies because these 2 policies set the shortest and longest duration allowed for an allocation, including renewals. And to ensure all allocations are a minimum of 2 hours long, I've set that minimum checkout reserve policy to 2 hours. Now, to ensure that all of my allocations end by close that day, regardless of varying closing times, I set this max checkout reserve to same day. This ensures that all users can create reservations for the full day, but not for multiple days. Now, to better control those renewals, especially within the patron portal, it's also very important to review and set these renewal policies right here. So this includes the renewal count limit, the default renewal time, as well as the minimum and the maximum checkout renewals. Now, for my locations, I want users to be able to renew up until the end of the day, and I don't want any additional policies to impede that. So my max checkout reserve is sufficient, and I haven't set an additional cap on the maximum renewal time or the number of times that a patron or an operator could renew. However, I did add a default renewal time to provide a more user-friendly and guided experience when patrons are renewing through the patron portal. So the default renewal time is the automatic time that will be applied when a patron or an operator renews this allocation. Now, anytime we're adjusting these renewal policies or the minimum and maximum checkout return policies, there's also 2 patron portal policies that I recommend reviewing at the same time. And these are found within this patron portal tab right here. And that is allow self renewals and patron portal reservation limit. So Allow Self-Service Renewals must be enabled to allow patrons to independently renew via the patron portal. And this is a really helpful feature if folks need to extend their use of a location while they're actually using it. And the self-service reservation limit will set a maximum reservation duration that is applied to the patron portal only. So this policy defines the initial duration allowed prior to any renewals. And I set this limit to 4 hours to limit the initial reservation duration of my rooms to a max of 4 hours. But this policy combined with that max checkout reserve and my renewal policies will allow patrons to renew their checkout up until the end of the day as long as a location is available. So they can continue to work just as long as that room is still available. So the key thing to understand, you'll use the same policies, and these policies will work together to enforce your usage rules. Now, the next policy I want to highlight is auto circulate, and this is found right here in the resource types tab. And you'll see me highlight this on the screen. And auto circulate is one of my favorite features while circulating locations. So if your patrons do not need to be escorted to a room, or if they don't need to pick up a key, auto circulate may work for you. So auto circulate will automatically pick up reservations at that scheduled start time and return reservations at the scheduled end time. This means that operators do not need to pick up or return reservations. So this setting allows that reservations that we saw earlier to automatically be picked up and returned. And you may see, or you will see, some of those allocations update on the front page once we return back. Now, the final setting that I'm just going to highlight today is what makes my setup a bit unique. And this is actually found within the resource type details screen. So I'll navigate over here back to the resource type details screen for my daily use office spaces. And the setting I want to highlight is disable RRT. So when this setting is enabled, web checkout will reserve a resource of the type by ID, even if the operator or the patron selects the option to reserve by type. So by enabling this setting, patrons can simply reserve a type or a category of a room that they need, and web checkout will assign an available room of this type. And this is the setting that allowed me to reserve a location earlier, so just any Adobe Edit Bay, but web checkout assigned a specific room to me, and that's how I was able to see in my allocation details and in the email which room I should arrive to. Now, again, this setup is a bit unique, so keep in mind you can still use the traditional RRT reservation method, and you can still reserve your locations by ID. And this brings me to the final configuration that I do want to highlight, and that is those custom emails. So again, you can navigate to Admin Organization and over to the Messaging tab, because you can customize email templates for circulating locations or for your checkout center that will manage circulating locations. Now, when you circulate locations, it's important to be mindful of how your emails read. If you're not expecting patrons to physically come pick up the equipment, you'll likely want to edit these emails to ensure that your check-in process is clearly communicated. All right. So this brings us to the end of our session today. But before we end, we're going to review some special considerations and key takeaways when managing room reservations and web checkout. So it's important to understand that no additional modules are needed. So congratulations, locations are available. You can add them into your checkout center within web checkout. However, you may need to expand your license to add on a new checkout center or up the number of resources allowed at your center. Now, I do recommend reaching out to your account manager for more information. Now, another congratulations, because you likely already have the skills you need to manage locations in web checkout. Since no additional modules are needed, this learning curve should be minimal, and you can already use those skills that you've learned to manage your equipment and apply that to locations. Now, implementing locations may be unique and require a different setup from your equipment. So again, we do recommend purchasing professional services and working closely with your customer success manager to ensure a successful implementation. And finally, managing locations in web checkout will allow you to use one application and take advantage of all of the features in web checkout that you rely on the most now to manage your locations. So today was just a quick glance at how to really manage circulating locations in web checkout, and I hope to work with some of you all in the future. All right, now before we end our session today, I do want to review some of these questions we got.
Right, great job, Brittany. We have a question from Paul Brown. Paul says, great to see the disable RRT option. Does this also work with equipment types?
Absolutely. You can disable it for both equipment and location resource types.
Perfect. And then we had kind of a combination question from Ryan Varian and Lisa Hamill. So they're looking for, so in Ryan's case, having locations that are currently listed as equipment resources, wanting to change that to location resources, and possibly decommissioning some of those. Do you have any suggestions for if there have been resources that have been created as equipment, changing those to the meta class location?
Unfortunately, you won't be able to update the meta class from equipment to location. I would probably recommend not at the beginning of your semester, but when you do have downtime, decommissioning those and recreating those as location resources, because then you can use many of the features that you saw today. I hope that answered your question.
I also just want to note on that, Lisa, I'm going to pop my email into chat. If you don't have a decommission center, just shoot me an email back and I'll be able to help you with that. Brittany, the next question is from James. So James says, scenario, delinquent students trash a reserved space. Can we add room condition to reservation?
Yeah, so like room condition to a reservation. Would that mean including like information about each the actual condition of the location?
Yeah, and James, are you looking, would that be like commenting on the reservation itself, or would you like to update the condition note for that location resource?
I'm not sure what the best place to put that information is. I'm just wondering if there is like other like physical resources. Is there some place where I can say, by the way, it got checked back in, the room is available again, but it's a disaster. So that somebody knows to do something about it. We also can, track it to a particular user.
Yeah, so it does look like you could include a condition note. You could also include an internal note, because condition note will be visible within the patron portal. If you want something more internal, I believe we could add a custom property. But if you want the condition of the location to be visible in the patron portal, you could update the condition note. You also might want to consider adding in like usage policies into the patron portal that folks need to agree to. before submitting that reservation. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm not so concerned about like it being publicly visible. I just want to know that for the particular checkout, like we know it was reserved at this date, and this user is the one who's responsible for creating the disaster.
Got it.
Students get out of control.
Got it. So if you want to update the actual physical condition of a location, the condition note is best, but it sounds like you want to add a note that this patron has been giving you trouble in your locations. You can, within the patron record, include, right, a contact note or include a custom property just to include a note. You could also place that patron on hold if they trash, right, a location to prevent them from making another reservation at your center.
Thank you, Brittany. Great question, James. I also see Paul Brown has a hand raised. Paul, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up this topic about like managing spaces, because I think that's something a lot of us, deal with, in our operations. We have a number of edit rooms that we physically circulate keys for. There's pros and cons to that approach. We have discussed over the years and brainstormed about auto circulation. What I'm really curious to hear from other web checkout users is what is like the on the ground workflow for the students to then gain access to the space, like key cards. What do you see as the pro? What have you seen as the pros to that approach of auto circulation? And most importantly, what are the cons? Like, do students just go into a room without reserving? I'd love to hear from the community on that.
Yeah, so anyone in the community, has anybody here, you can pop in a chat or feel free to unmute yourself. Has anybody had problems with auto circulate? Well, Paul, it must work great. No.
Yeah, and web checkout, it's great. I mean, it could save a lot of time in operations. It also would prevent lost keys or students going home within their pocket. But obviously, students can be students, and I'm just trying to look ahead to experiences others have had. So, but that's fine if nobody has anything at the moment.
Yeah. That might be a really good topic for the community too, to bring up for the folks that aren't here today.
And Paul, one thing I was thinking is I'm not certain if you have the ticketing module, but if you do, it could be a thing where you have it auto circulate, but have your operators just do a room check for cleanliness, a couple times a week. And you could track that through ticketing. So that's one potential solution, just to make sure that the rooms are being kept up.
Yeah, we right now though, we don't inspect the film department editing bays, so we don't manage the space itself, but we handle all the scheduling. So we don't generally go into the spaces, but we do circulate the keys, and auto circulation offers a definitely efficiency benefit. What was really interesting is as you're talking about the hours it's available, like we're only open till 10 o'clock and we have a drop box, but it prevents, if you had auto circulate, technically you could have someone starting there at 6 a.m. or 2 a.m. or whatever. So there's definite benefits to it, but it's always good to hear users' experiences too.
Excellent.
Thank you for that. Is there any other question from anyone else? Feel free to unmute yourself or pop it into chat. All right. Well, great job, Brittany.
Thanks. All right, folks. So I will ask you to take one more poll before we take a wonderful break. All right, folks, I am launching a poll right now. So with this poll, we are asking, are you interested in using web checkout to manage rooms? So yeah, yes, no, or do you already manage those locations within web checkout? So thank you to everyone that joined me for my session today. Please be sure to vote before you take a quick break to stretch your legs and to grab a snack. But please be sure to join us for our fourth and final session of the day. And for that session, we're going to ask you folks to actually unmute your mic so you can join in on the conversation. So it's 2:55 Central. We'll get started at 3:00 p.m. So please vote on that poll, and I should see you folks in about 5 minutes.